we'll be looking at today. And they are found in the end of the ministry of Jesus. There is debate about, are they the same, in fact, occurrence or not? Many scholars say they are separate. Warren Wiersbe, a very conservative and good scholar, says no, they're two separate incidents. Up to date, any of y'all know a fellow named by the name of Platt that wrote a book called Radical? Okay, one of the great writers. He is a genius, really. I mean, he had all of his academics done, and he was a professor and teaching before he was 29. Just an amazing person, and now he is the president of Southern Baptist International Mission Board, and he says it's two separate events. So kind of looking at that material as you're finding John 2nd chapter, we're going to look beginning in verse 13 at this 40 days of Jesus theme that we have found ourselves engaged with, along with the skit guys. How many of you know who the skit guys are? Man, they just have an unbelievable giftedness for our time, I think, to demonstrate. Now, and you're going to be touched. Listen, if you aren't touched today by this particular video that we're going to show in a moment, pinch yourself, because something's wrong. I mean, it will knock your socks or nylon hose or whatever off. Okay? Well, I knew my wife didn't have on socks, so I wanted to include her. And but you are going to be really, I think, touched by this creative way that they've helped us to look at what it would be like if you were a person who showed up on the day that Jesus cleansed the temple. Now, don't get confused. If you go and you look, it often will take you to dealing with the widow that gives the offering when she comes to the temple. It's not that story. This is the cleansing of the temple. And so today I offer a message entitled, When Convenience Becomes Corruption, Jesus Steps In. Isn't it great? Y'all have any issues like that? I was at the grocery store this week, and it wasn't Publix. It was the store where they sell a lot of good things at a very low price. And it wasn't Walmart either. And as I was in the store, there weren't that many people in the store, which is normal for this store. And when it came time to check out, there was one individual who had opened one register, and there were literally 4 of us in line at one register. And the lady behind me, you could tell by her body language, seems like they could open another register. And I just simply turned and said, "Ma'am, are you in a hurry?" I was in front of her. There were 2 people in front of me, one of whom was being checked out. And I said, "Are you in a hurry?" And she said, "Well, no." I said, "Well, I mean, you're welcome to go in front of me if you're in a hurry." And, I realized as I think back, I'm like that. You ever get in the line at McDonald's and you are angry because they don't get what you ordered right now? Oh, come on. Don't act like you hadn't been there. When our greed and our need to have impulsive stuff met immediately, those impulses of our life met, and we begin to think we're entitled to that. Yeah, sometimes convenience is met with what? Corruption. We have a story like that today. And so I want to read this story to you in these verses found in John's Gospel, chapter 2. It says, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover. Now, that's a feast. It's one of 7 that we find in the Old Testament, but it's one of 3 out of those 7 that were demanded of every Jewish male within 3 days' walk or within what they call the Judean kingdom. If you go to Deuteronomy 16:16, you can find them. Along with that, not only is this feast that represents the miraculous deliverance by God of the Jewish people, is the feast of Pentecost, which celebrates the giving of the law. And then with it, the third is the Feast of Tabernacles, or sometimes referred to as the Feast of Booths. And that reminds them of their wilderness wanderings and how God takes care and gives you manna and quail and water and the things you need when you have desperate situations in your life. And so this is one of those mandatory feasts. As you see in point 1, it's a convenience because these feasts are going on, that while they're going on, Passover was primarily a time when they would come and they would offer gifts and sacrifices. And it says that Jesus is there, and it's the Jewish Passover. And so we went up to Jerusalem and probably went up from Judea. He's come from the turning of the water into wine, and he's on his way up there to the city. And when he gets there, it says in the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. Now, this is a convenience offered to Jewish pilgrims who've come to Jerusalem to worship. Now, the reason is, and let me just take you real quick over to the book of Acts. Kind of hold your finger there and turn over to Acts chapter 2. So you'll get an idea of what's going on. It says, here he is on one of those 3 mandatory feasts, the specific feast of the Passover, and there is a need for convenience. Why? Notice verse 5 of Acts 2. It says, now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from where? Every nation under heaven. It lists 13 that are represented. If you go down through there and read those names. And that just simply means that when you come from somewhere else and you're making a long journey, you don't want to have to drag a sheep, a goat, something of that nature. And especially once you get there with that particular animal, then someone has to say it's okay to sacrifice that animal. You need some pre-approval. Okay? And so in order to be convenient to the worshipers, there was this pre-approval not only of all these different animal sacrifices, but also of the money that would be given. Could not have a coin or that which would represent idolatry. It had to be Jewish coinage, and thus they had people who did exchange of currency. If you've ever been out of the country, I'm telling you, people care about you using their money. Any of y'all ever ran into that? You know, at Atlanta, you have to do this currency exchange, and always you're looking for the person who will give you the best deal on the currency exchange. Is it important? Well, we're in Switzerland, and we have euros. And I think, well, I'm in Europe. I needed a geography lesson. And there was this wonderful smell that came roaring out of a little trailer where this guy was cooking sausages. And we went up and we ordered a sausage to go in what we would call a hamburger bun. And I get one for my wife and I hand it to her. And I get mine and I lay it down and I get ready to pay. Well, what do you think my wife did while I was getting ready to pay? She took a big bite out of that sausage. Oh, and it was good. I could tell by all the nonverbal comments she was making. It was good. Okay. And when I handed the euro to the guy in the little trailer in Switzerland, he said, I can't take that. You'll have to go over to the bank and get a Swiss franc. To which I took my wife's sandwich with a bite of it and handed it back to him. To which he took the sausage out of the sandwich, put it back on the grill, go get the right money. You know, people are really strange about this. And, you know, the Jews were, yeah, I'm thinking, my goodness, you could get something for that euro. It was worth more than what you were wanting me to exchange it for to start off with. You know, and so, at that time it was. And so, you know, these kinds of things. But they were very particular about their money. And so there's a matter of convenience when it comes to the temple courts, and all those things in them, the sheep, the cattle, the doves, and the money exchange. So it says in verse 15, he sat down. After you have to go to some other translations and into the Greek, it says so, that pause means that he's not doing this impulsively. He sits down and he takes time and he makes a whip. And I don't know what it would have been like to have been there. But here's an idea of what it might have been like. Watch this.
I was there the day that Jesus walked into the temple. He just stood there at first, almost as in disbelief. And then I saw it. I saw that fire growing in his eyes. I'd come from Galilee to the place where God said he'd meet us. Did it feel like a scam? Yeah. I was never able to afford a lamb for my sacrifice, so I had to settle for one of those overpriced pigeons. As a young wife and mother, there's a word you never expect to be called. Widow. I didn't realize how safe I'd felt with my husband around until he was gone. And then it just felt like being exposed on every side with nothing in between, your babies and a world of vipers. But me, just me. So I stood there that day in the temple and I watched as Jesus grabbed a whip and drove those businessmen out of the temple, poured their money on the ground. But more than that, there was something about the expression on his face. I recognized it. He swung that whip like vipers were threatening his kids. He said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Took me 3 years to figure out what he meant. Slow learner. He wasn't talking about the building. That was a place where dishonest men put their grimy fingerprints all over God's glory. They defiled the intimate process of worshiping him. That day wasn't about destruction. It was about hope. Because now, knowing God is all about Jesus. As I think about that day back in the temple, and I remember what Jesus did and how he did it, it felt like being rescued. Life can still be brutal. The kids' appetites are still growing. I still cry a lot. But he made a place for me to be still, where rest and trust meet right there at God's feet. And the price of that access, it's paid because of Jesus. He conquered death, and that's how I make it through life.
Was there anyone not touched by that truth? Wow. the cleansing of the temple. There was convenience in the fact that a feast that was mandatory was met with the fact that due to the teaching of the Torah, every male within 3 days' journey had to attend. And in order to facilitate that pilgrimage, as well as those from all over the world, these things were offered. But the purpose, you see, of this area allowed what originally was meant for good to become corrupt. Corruption entered because of the misuse of the location. The temple had a unique design. It had a place for the people of God. But it had a place where the people of God met people who wanted to know God. And that took place in the court of the Gentiles. In this place of outreach, this place of connection, this place where God intended that the one true living God be offered to the desperate situation of sin and the lives of people be offered, and we took it and exploited that and made it into a place to make money. Folks, it grieves my soul when I look at how many courts of Gentiles exist in churches today. People show up to do ministry when really what they want is money. People show up and they're electrifying in their personality and persuasion when their true desire is to fleece the sheep, and when questioned about their wealth and money, they'll simply say, well, if you had the faith that you should have, you'd have what I've got. Folks, that economy doesn't exist in God's Word. Be sure you try them by the Spirit. A lot of false prophets. But I tell you something else. There are a lot of false things that go on in God's church. In the name of convenience, do we find ourselves putting our grubby hands on God's glory? Do we find ourselves polluting the very presence of God by our dispositions and our attitudes? Do we find ourselves turning God's people into those who would exchange peace and trust for personal privilege? Well, there was corruption. Beginning in verse 16, it says, to those who sowed the doves, very carefully watch this, to those who sowed the doves, Jesus said this, get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace. If you go over to the book of Mark and Luke and Matthew, he said, it's written, quoting Isaiah about God's place for worship, my house shall be called a house of prayer. You know why it's important for people to pray in God's house? It's because, when you shut your eyes and in that surrender, you bow yourself in your spirit before God, He brings what's real to the surface. I'm convinced that's why I and most of you don't pray as much as we do. Because when you pray, you're directly confronted by God. Now, you can bring your God talk and your God posture and your different types of articulating prayer and how it ought to go on. But if you truly come with a broken and a contrite spirit before a holy God, He will touch you where your problem is at in order to give you the peace that He alone can give. And I'm wondering this morning, have we corrupted corrupted in our church and in our church services? Those same kinds of things. Have we turned the house of God into a theater of entertainment? We need to be careful not to bring corruption in the midst of convenience. How nice to sit on a padded chair. Is yours soft? Are you too hot or too cold? Well, I can tell you there's enough issue among this many people. Somebody is too hot and somebody is too cold. Oh, I love the fact that we put registers up here and they've got numbers and all that kind of stuff. They don't run anything. You know why? Because the hot person messes with them and the cold person messes with them, and it would confuse the instrument. You know, it's a funny thing. The first time I saw that happen, and they were just dummy registers. It used to be, you know, you would move the little dial from one side to the other, and it was humorous to go and watch how people would move it from one side to the other. You know, the person who gets cold, and you'll see them in here wrapped up in something, and they'll be up there trying to turn it up. And the person that's sweating, and they're hot, and they're taking off their cloak, and they're usually wearing something, and they're up there trying to make it colder. We never think about the fact that other people have as much right to be here as us, right? To be ministered to by lovely buildings and aesthetics and things of that nature as the rest. The reason is we come in, and I would tell you folks, it's a corruption when we come to church and our focus is on us and not on Him. That's a corruption. And so the Scripture says there was this corruption going on, and Jesus addresses it. And the reason that He's this way, verse 17 explains for us. He says the disciples, after all this occurred, kind of like her 3 years later, remembered that it was said, zeal for your house will consume me. Jesus' love for God and what God had done in and through Him for others cost Him His life. So He took the stand in the place where it was a market. And you want to get Baptists mad? Mess with their money. Now, before y'all get too humored, if I want to get you mad, all I need to do is mess with your money. You know why? Your money represents what you consider to be valuable. That's why people have trouble with tithes and offerings. They actually think it's their money and not God's. He simply puts you in stewardship over it. Corruption. When we are not careful about where we are, and there is geographical location, but we're not talking about that, are we? We're talking about spiritual location. Where we are, exploitation can take place. The temple was the only place that Jews could come to worship. A real confusion in our culture today about Jews worshiping in synagogues. They can go there and they can read their prayers and go through their liturgy, and but you ask any Jew who understands their faith, they'll never really be able to worship until the temple's rebuilt. Now, that brings you into an area of eschatology, that study about end things, and I can tell you, it doesn't matter to me which one of those major views you take. There are about 4 of them. There's one thing you better know, no matter which view you take. When you see that temple being rebuilt over there, you better get ready. Because they all encompass the fact that when God restores the worship of Israel, He's on His way back. And so the place, the source of worship, that's where today, you and I came hopefully with a prepared heart to meet a holy God. That's where worship takes place. Wherever two or more are gathered together, what? In my name. Now, let's all get up here and hold hands, at least three of us, and say, we're here in the name of Jesus. That doesn't bring his presence. But if you get up there and you hold hands, and each of you in a broken and a contrite spirit with a heart ready to do the perfect will of God are gathered there over that matter, then I'll tell you what, he's there. Amen. He's there. But sometimes we use convenience and we use convention, thinking we can manipulate God. How foolish. How foolish. And so, exploitation. I wanted you to look real careful at this text because Jesus was not in any way tampering with worship. In verse 16 it said, to those who sowed doves. She talked about overpriced pigeons. I thought that was a pretty good way to say that. She'd been stripped of what she really wanted to do because of how her culture treated a single mother with children. But she still came there with the same desperateness of soul to have right relationship with God, that if you're here for the right reason, every one of us came for this morning. Doesn't matter that when you opened your pocketbook a while ago during the tithing portion, you put a $1 bill in there or a $500 bill in there. And all of you are looking around saying, who would put $500 in there? There are a lot of us that ought to be putting $500 in there if we're really honoring God with the tithe. We have some folks that we know are here because of the check that they put in and its amount. And some of them are way more than $500. And that person is thrilled to be able to do it. Amazing the difference in attitude when we come for the right reason and we take our grimy paws off of God's glory. Do you really want God to show up in your life? Do you really want God to show up at your church? Then you've got to do that. You got to take your grimy hands off of all the exploiting corruptiveness that's offered and given rise in convenience and do what God requires in order to get what God created as overflow. Y'all sang it this morning. Deep rises up to deep. What are you talking about? When you come to Christ and you give your heart and your life to Christ, out of your innermost being will flow rivers of living water. It comes out of an artesian well that's stirred up by the dynamic of God in our life, and it spills over away and apart from us onto others, because you see there are others that need to come. So you got to clean your marketplace up. You've got to get away from your fake agendas, and you've got to allow people to see God living and working in you so that they will know that you are not a hoax, and they can have the same thing done by God for them. Now, folks, that's the truth. That's the truth. And when we exploit the things of God in the place of God, it creates desecration. In the book of Samuel, the first book, chapter 4 and verse 22, the symbol of worship had been taken from Israel by the Philistines. And it was written by one of the daughters of Eli when that Ark of the Covenant that represented the law of God and the manna and the quail and the mercy seat and all the things that go with the Ark of the Covenant, when it was taken because of their unfaithfulness and disobedience out of Israel into the Philistine camp, she said this, the glory has departed. And folks, it can happen in your life. It can happen in the church when you and I cease to give honor to God and we give ourselves over to the ways of the enemy. He will take the glory of God right out of our life and right out of our church. That simply means His presence is removed from us. And when God's presence is removed, the wrath of sin carnage and destruction comes. Desecration, the glory has departed. It means to deprive. What did they deprive people of? They were meant as the priestly nation, that is Israel, to share the news of the one true God with every person who desperately needed Him. And there was a way to buy into and get into the Jewish faith through proselytizing. So if a person really wanted to come to what God was doing prior to Calvary through the Jewish people, there was a way in. And the instruction and the initiation of that great truth happened in the very place they set up this marketplace to exploit fellow Jews. And Jesus was angry about that. And I want to kind of correct your image of your Jesus. He's got a whip in one hand, and he's flipping tables with things on them. And we know those tables, as a general rule, weigh between 300 and 500 pounds. Now, if you've got a puny, skinny-looking little long-nosed, blue-eyed, long-haired Jesus, you got the wrong one. You get you a curly-headed, brown-eyed Jewish male from the carpenter shop with a bowed back and a strong neck and a grip that would crush you like a vice, because that's what carpenters get because of what they do. And he's flipping tables that weigh 300 to 500 pounds. Hey, there was nobody asking any questions about getting out of the way of this guy either. But notice, he did not destroy anything. In fact, when it came to the doves, he said, get these out of here. Because you see, he knew that the poor people needed a overpriced pigeon in order to worship. You know why he knew it? He was poor. He was more concerned about the distractions to worship and very concerned about the act of worship. So he removed what caused the desecration from the temple. Now, friend, that's what he's here to do today. He's here to remove from your life and from mine that which desecrates, that which is exploited due to convenience and time and place in your life where you've not given attention, so that God's glory can come again and rest on you and rest on our church. Well, I am so thankful when convenience becomes corruption. Jesus steps in. He steps in to clean house and make things right. And friend, that's what he's going to do today if you're going to leave here with his glory. He's going to come inside of you and inside of me, and he's going to remove all of the pollutants and all of the desecration, and he's going to restore a place for his glory. Now, I don't know if that's what you need, but friend, that's what I need every time I come to my Lord. I need him to get the junk out of my life so he can put Jesus back in there. And I hope that's what you need today. It says that Jesus sees. He found the temple. He came to to where this was supposed to be going on. And the scripture says that when he got there, he saw. Now, he didn't just see money changers and people exchanging and doing things that should be done for convenience so that pilgrims could come and worship. It was where they were doing it. It was how they were doing it. And when he saw that, you notice she said, I could see the fire in his eyes. He had righteous indignation. He had anger that was acceptable and right. And folks, we need to be those who begin to participate and offer some of that. Sometimes it's just a small thing. We were out to eat with this couple that sang this morning. We were at this local, very nice restaurant here in town. Two young men came down and sat at a table right behind us. It was obvious that they were showing affection for one another. But then one of them gets up and moves over and sits right next, pulls his chair right up next to the other one. He starts rubbing all over this guy with his hands. And then he has this wide open, passionate kiss. I'm going to tell you what, I was offended. And if you're a Christian, you should be offended. That's not acceptable behavior, period. If I started doing that stuff in a restaurant, they wouldn't have to worry about complaining to the manager. My wife would slap me on the floor. What I'm trying to tell you, folks, is there comes a time when we as believers need to know what's right and wrong, and we need to stand up and say something about it, even if all we can do is get up and walk out of the restaurant and say, I will not tolerate this. And you shouldn't. But you got to look up and see it. And you can't get caught up in the comfortable convenience of moral relativism and say, well, you know, it's all right for them, but it's not all right for me. I want to tell you something. It isn't right for God, period. Unless you want to go and extract those pages from your Bible. He reminds them of what it is to be God's. What does it mean to be God's? Doesn't it mean to be holy? Be holy because I'm holy. Isn't that what God said? That means you are to be unique and separate and set apart. It doesn't mean that you're to be ugly and nasty, but it does mean there are some things that ought to draw righteous indignation, and you should take definite actions as a result of it. And he reminds them that in God's house, the thing that brings that kind of heart is one that's yielded to God in prayer. And finally, I think Jesus realized, man, this is a mess. This is an absolute mess. You ever in a situation where you just feel like there's no hope? And it's such a mess that it can't ever be straightened out. Well, when Jesus saw that, he was reminded, wasn't he, of why God sent him. He was reminded that he came to seek and to save what's lost. Is there some lostness in you today? Young people, you face a culture that's unlike any that's ever existed in this country. And we pray for God's wisdom and God's power and God's strength to come inside of you and make you bold for your Lord. Because our culture desperately needs God's touch. And the glory's not going to come back until we clean the house and we make ourselves ready for him to be a part of us. So this morning, when we look at the cleansing of the temple, my encouragement is to know there are genuine worshipers, just like the woman in the video who have no power and no strength, but long to have what God offers. And there are those of us who are in the house of God that need to not let convenience allow corruption to enter, so that when people seek Him, He can be found through us and through our church. Pray with me. Father, thank you today for the truth of your word.